I heard the screen, like, make that noise, but I know it's not that.
Wow, this is a giant class. Wonder if there's anybody out there in Never Never Land watching. Doesn't seem to be turned on. How y'all doing? Ready for it to be over with? Or is it calling Plainview? Plainview, are you alive? She's got her head stuck in that computer. Is she asleep? Is your microphone working out there? Maybe I need some really, really loud sound effects or something. Glad you could join us. So we were working our way through Reconstruction last time. We were talking about how the radical Republicans kind of got Andrew Johnson out of their way so they could do Reconstruction the way they wanted to, laying a trap for him. Can't remember how much we talked about that, but basically what they did was they passed a number of laws that they figured he wouldn't be able to tolerate, and he would probably break them, then they could impeach him. And it worked. One of the very few times that, oh, I got to go back to the other office and pick up. Right. Right back.
Mr. Hunt, if you're talking, we can't hear you.
Sorry for being gone. I'm getting communications from somebody that I teach that might have COVID, so I'm paying attention to it. Nobody that I was. Huh? Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. We didn't realize you weren't in there.
Oh, no, You mean, I could just go on and on and on, and you wouldn't know whether I was here or not. No, I left my stick drive over in the other office. And that has my my PowerPoint stuff on it. And of course, this is all being recorded, so there's a record of me not being here. Think they'll fire me? Maybe they'll fire me. I could go fishing. I could go ice fishing. Bear with me for a minute. I'm trying to pull up. If you look in your notes and readings, if you've got your computer in front of you, I changed the notes and readings just a little bit. The one that says, the one about lectures, and it's got a thing called Reconstruction Review. And that's the PowerPoint I'm going to use just because I like it a little bit better than the other ones I have. One of the problems when you're an old man and you don't have any life is you keep rewriting things. So I mess around with this all the time. So basically, when we were talking about it before, let's just go back really, really fast and look at, if I can get it to come up on the screen here for you. Let's go back as far as talking about developments that took us into Reconstruction, and I'm going to do it really fast now, get up to the part we haven't done yet and slow down a little bit. But we talked about Lincoln's proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction, other named 10% plan, which was a kind of an easy way for the southern states to come into the Union. And we talked about the Wade-Davis bill the following year, which was a much more difficult way for the states to come back into the Union. The radical Republicans wanted to punish them. And we talked about the 13th Amendment getting through the House of Representatives, first the Senate in April '64, then the House of Representatives in January of '65. So what happens at that stage? At that stage, it goes out to the states for ratification. We also, I think, mentioned the Freedmen's Bureau, and I'd like you to remember that. I mean, the Freedmen's Bureau was to take care of recently freed slaves who really had no idea where to go or what to do, how to feed themselves, with food, housing, oversight, education, healthcare, employment, things like that. Later on, the Freedmen's Bureau will also help former slaves to try and locate their families, because of course, as slaves, their families were subject to being broken up. The president asked Frederick Douglass to run it, and Frederick Douglass very astutely told the president, you need to pick one of your own generals to run it so that he has the power to push it, to make it run. I'm a black man. It's going to be a lot of trouble, me trying to run that in the South. And the president follows his advice and picked a Union Army general named O.O. Howard, and he's going to run that bureau for quite a while. We talked about the 14th of April, Abraham Lincoln's assassination. He was actually shot on the 14th. He died in the morning of the 15th and never regained consciousness. It was kind of gross if you read the medical treatment and all that. It was, really, really sad. And I think only when he was assassinated did you really get a sense across the whole country that people had learned, begun to love the president. And even the people in the South, many people in the South, when Abraham Lincoln was killed, went, oh my God, our only chance of getting back into the Union without major damage is gone. Because the radicals in Congress were out for our blood. So even the people in the South regretted his death. Andrew Johnson becomes the 17th president. I mentioned the execution of 4 of the plot members in the assassination plot. Remember, that assassination plot aimed to kill the president, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of War, and the Vice President. But they only killed the president. 13th Amendment is ratified in December of 1865. We don't need to look at pictures of the radical Republicans. One group that we have to remember, the Bourbon Democrats. Bourbon has nothing to do with alcohol. Bourbon they're talking about is the Bourbon family of France. They're the monarchs. It's kind of like an elite group of Democrats. These guys wanted to get business going again, wanted the economy running again. These are both Northerners and Southerners. They weren't particularly interested in human rights or anything like that. They just wanted the economy to recover. They didn't oppose giving money for schools and things like that for freedmen, but their main focus was money. And I've named a number of them from that period of time, and a couple, well actually, there's 3 pictures on here. The only one that really counts for us is Samuel Tilden from New York. The other 2 people were around at different times. Grover Cleveland was our president eventually, and he was a Bourbon Democrat. They tended to be more conservative than the rest of the Democrats. There was another group of people that called themselves Democrats. I'm not sure all the Democrats would like that. Most people call them the Redeemers. And these people were trying to take the South back into what it was like before 1860. They had to face up to the fact that slaves were emancipated, but they did everything they could to make slaves back into slaves one way or the other. They're the ones probably who wrote all the black codes, and we'll talk about that. In your readings, if you haven't read it already, in your readings, the readings that will help you prepare for Quiz 10, the last quiz, there's a thing about the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and there's a thing about the black codes. In particular, this is the black codes in Mississippi. They were more comprehensive than in some states. And the black codes are explained in that reading, but basically, the idea of the black codes is to ensure that people of African origin never get onto equal standing with white people. And also to guarantee that the white farm owners and people like that will have a source of cheap labor. They'll have to pay them something, but they want cheap labor. And when Grant becomes president, you'll notice a little thing about that, where he acknowledges what those people are up to. I have to say the black codes up front in any of these black codes, like the Mississippi Black Code, there are a lot of rights that they give to people of color, but the further into it you get, the more you realize that they're not getting the full rights of an American citizen because of these laws. Right down to the level of the fact that if you're black and you're arrested for vagrancy and you can't pay the fines, the jailer can rent you out to people and you'll be forced to work for them, which is virtually slavery all over again. So that's how bad they were. One organization that came up in 1865 in that era was the Ku Klux Klan, founded in Pulaski, Tennessee by Confederate veterans. At first it was just a social club. Eventually it's going to be subverted into being a group that goes around putting muscle against northern politicians, muscle against Republicans down in the South. to try and chase the carpetbaggers out, to try and keep African Americans from voting. And they used terror in many forms, public whippings, murder, you name it. And I'm willing to guess that we'll never know how many people were killed. I'll go back to that slide in a second. The radicals in Congress were angry. They're going to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1866 to fight against this. And it said pretty clearly, everyone born in the U.S., not subject to foreign power, is a citizen and has all the rights of citizens. It was aimed at freed slaves, but it included other people, people of color, already free black people, that sort of thing. In the slide I have here, one group it doesn't mention that's mentioned in your readings are American Indians. And it says that people subject to foreign power or American Indians not taxed aren't automatically citizens, even if they're born in the U.S. What does that mean, not taxed? Well, if an Indian lived in normal society, was being assimilated into the normal society, he has to pay taxes just like anybody else. But if he lives on a reservation and sticks with that form of society, he doesn't have to pay taxes. And what they were saying is reservation Indians aren't citizens. That won't change all the way until 1924, when all Native Americans become citizens, whether they're on the reservation or not. 14th Amendment is passed by Congress in June of 1866. Now it's going to go out for ratification. It's kind of got four parts to it. One is it kind of defines what being a citizen means in the term of your rights. The second part is a clause that says if the state tries to infringe upon anyone's rights, the state will be punished by the federal government. Another portion says that no one should pay off the Confederacy's debts. That seems kind of strange to put in the Constitution, but the radical Republicans wanted to put in there, who are they punishing by saying that the Confederate States wouldn't pay debts? Just common sense question. Confederate States borrowed money. Who'd they borrow money from? Who would you guess they borrowed money from? Not the North. North's not going to lend them any money during the war. I'm talking about during the war. Europe. So that's a little, a little message to our European friends. Hey, you guys, the ones that gave the South money to fight with, kiss that money off. You're never going to see one penny of it. But why did they put it in the Constitution? They put it in the Constitution for a very simple political reason. If you put something in an amendment and it's ratified into the Constitution, it's really hard to get rid of it. And they wanted to make sure that subsequent administrations didn't go back and repeal a law. So they put it in the Constitution. It really doesn't belong there, but it's there. Also in 1866, there's an election. This is an interesting election. It's a midterm election. So the presidency's not up for elections. It's just members of Congress, representatives and some senators. President Johnson goes around the countryside voting for Democrats. Remember, he's a Democrat. He's a unionist Democrat. He campaigns for either Democrats or moderate Republicans. But no one's listening. He doesn't have much prestige at all. The Republicans are going to win in a landslide. And the thing about the Republicans, because of the black codes and the treatment of freed slaves and things like that in the South, even the moderate Republicans are becoming radicalized. They're getting angrier and angrier. So after this election, the Republicans control over 77% of all the seats in the Senate and the House of Representatives. if you think about that, there's one obvious significance to that. How many votes does it take to overturn a presidential veto? It takes 2/3 vote in the House and a 2/3 vote in the Senate. That's 66%. So if they've got over 77%, anything the president vetoes, they can pass over his veto if they want. And they will. They'll veto more. He vetoes at least 14 bills, and they pass every one of them over his veto. In March of '67, when the new Congress is just coming in, they're going to pass 3 laws we call the Reconstruction Act. I'm oversimplifying it here, but let's leave it that way. That's good enough to pass the exam. The Military Reconstruction Act, which splits all of the Confederacy up into 5 districts. Each district is under control of a Union Army Major General. That's a 2-star general. Now, to keep the president from messing around with Reconstruction, they passed 2 more laws at the same time. One is the Command of the Army Act, which says that the only one in the military, the president's the commander-in-chief. So they say under the Command of the Army Act, the president can only deal through the commanding general of the Army, who happens to be Ulysses S. Grant, and the radical Republicans consider him to be one of their guys. Then they also passed something called the Tenure of Office Act, because the Secretary of War, even though he's a pro-union Democrat, he's very, very tight with the radical Republicans. And they don't want the president to be able to fire him, so they make this new law, the Tenure of Office Act, which says, remember, when a president appoints someone, he nominates someone to be like Secretary of State or whatever, the Senate has to give their advice and consent. The Tenure of Office Act says, if the president wants to fire somebody like that, he also has to get the advice and consent of the Senate. So now he can't fire his own people. They know that's going to make him mad, and sure enough, he tries to do a tap dance and get around the Tenure of Office Act and fire the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, and put Ulysses S. Grant in his place as Secretary of War. Grant says, no, I don't want to get involved in this. And the House of Representatives are going to vote articles of impeachment against the president. They're going to vote to put him on trial, the result of which could kick him out of office. By the way, the 14th Amendment, while all this is going on, is ratified in July of 1868. Andrew Johnson is impeached in February of 1868 by the U.S. House of Representatives on 11 articles of impeachment. But when it actually came to a trial in the Senate, you know how impeachment works, right? Everybody in here understands. The House of Representatives impeaches you. It's kind of like being indicted. And once you're impeached, you go on trial before the Senate. And the entire Senate is your jury. And the judge is the Chief Justice of the United States. And your defense lawyers and all that are provided by the Senate and the House of Representatives. They didn't convict him. They certainly had enough votes to convict him. So the thought goes to your mind, why didn't they convict him? Did we talk about this last time at all? So why wouldn't you, if you're a senator and you're a smart one and you're worried about your country, why wouldn't you convict the president and kick him out? I can think of 2 reasons. One reason was we didn't have a vice president. And that would put an unelected official, because at that time the next man in line is the Secretary of State. He's not even elected. That's one reason. But a more important reason is that the members of Congress the members of the Senate, didn't want to set a precedent where if you kind of didn't like the president, you could kick him out that way, that easily. They thought if they set that precedent, it would cause our government not to be stable anymore. You know, in a parliamentary government, they can vote their prime minister out at the drop of a hat. And we didn't want something like that. We wanted more stability. And in fact, how many presidents have been impeached? Johnson, Clinton, and Trump. And no one's ever been convicted. No one's ever been kicked out of office. You have to think about the office of president, even if you were only elected vice president. You're elected by a general election of all the people. So where do guys that are just elected by one state get off trying to kick the president out? That's the argument. But they didn't do it to Johnson. But Johnson got the message anyway. He went back to the White House, closed the door, and kept his nose out of Reconstruction. And that's all that Congress wanted. When we come up to 68, later in 68, in November, we have another presidential election. And this time, the radical Republicans are going to put the fellow they consider to be their boy, Ulysses S. Grant, put his name in there for president. And the Democrats will nominate a northern Democrat. The southern Democrat wouldn't have a chance. His name is Horatio Seymour. Grant's going to win thumbs down. He's the most famous, most respected man in the United States. Lincoln is dead. They would have voted for Lincoln. So Grant's the man. He will become the 18th president of the United States. Complex man. He had some weaknesses. One of his weaknesses, it sounds like a good thing, he was loyal to the people who served in the army with him, to a fault. And we have discovered over the years that while most army officers are legitimate people who fight for their country, risk sacrifice, and that sort of thing, that doesn't necessarily qualify them to be something like a president. Another thing was that he felt that the president should carry out the wishes of the Congress, that the president shouldn't initiate bills, things like that, that was up to the Congress. And a third thing that was a real weakness, he tried business on his own when he left the army the first time. And he never succeeded. He didn't do well anywhere. Pretty much a business failure. And he really admired self-made men, people who started with nothing and became millionaires. And he liked to rub shoulders with them. Was he corrupt? Was he taking their money? Nah. No, he wasn't. He was very careful. At one point, when one corrupt group tried to influence him, they sent him a bunch of furniture and stuff like that. He had that stuff boxed up and mailed right back to him. He wouldn't put up with that. That doesn't mean, though, that he didn't have a blind spot as far as the people that worked for him, because he was loyal to the people that worked for him. And so if one of them went wrong, you had a lot of trouble convincing Grant that that they were in the wrong. Railroads finished, 1869, Transcontinental Railroad. 15th Amendment ratified, 1870. Now, 1870 to 1871, things aren't going well in Mississippi, they're not going well in Tennessee, they're not going well in other southern states. There are these groups, like the KKK, like the Knights of the White Camellia, like the Red Shirts, who work hard to prevent people of African origin from exercising their rights as citizens, who worked hard to get rid of the so-called carpetbaggers, the Republicans who'd come south, some of whom with larceny in their hearts and some of whom with legitimate thoughts about helping reform the South. There's people dying. There's people being subject to public whipping and things like that by these different groups. And Congress is fed up with it. And so Congress starts passing what they call enforcement acts to give the president certain powers to deal with this. You realize that the military, in the normal course of events, is not allowed to serve as a police force. If you don't understand that, just consider the problem along, for example, the Texas border right now. The military can go down there and provide support like helicopter coverage and camera coverage and that sort of thing, but they're not allowed to arrest anybody because it's against an act called Posse Comitatus, and we'll talk about that next semester if any of you show up. Can't use soldiers as cops. Now, under the Force Acts, the first Force Act that's passed in 1870 is intended to protect black voters, or black voting. It's not very effective, so they passed a second one in 1870 that provides for federal supervision of Southern elections. That still doesn't work well enough because there's too much violence. Just plain old marshals can't just go down there and take care of that. So in 1871, they passed what they call the KKK Act. Doesn't mention the Ku Klux Klan anywhere, but it certainly describes it, or organizations like it. And, you know, the old thing about walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and it must be a duck. They do the walking part and the quacking part and let you figure out who they are. And there are plenty of other organizations anyway. But they allow the president to go into an area where these people have been violent and created mayhem, declare martial law, suspend habeas corpus, and start arresting people. And he does that. He sets an example. He goes down to South Carolina. 2 counties, one of them is Union County, I can't remember the other county. They've had violence. There was a mass mob lynching. 8 African Americans were lynched. He sends troops down there, declares martial law, suspends habeas corpus, and starts picking up leaders of the KKK. In fact, he destroyed the KKK in South Carolina. And then you'll look at me and say, but the KKK still exists. The original KKK died that year. It'll come back because the KKK was never really a massive organization. It was a lot of guys that were lookalikes in different places. They weren't coordinated. After 1915, we get a new KKK that seems to be a little bit more coordinated, but still not very well coordinated, and they'll die out too. So he's going to make an example of South Carolina. It works pretty well, at least for a while. In 18, I want to say, let's see, last election was 66, then you get 68 with Grant in, so another 2 years will be 70 when this violence starts to spring up. 75, there's another election, or 74. There were riots in Memphis, Tennessee. There were riots in Mississippi. And what it was, all of those cities down there were trying to drive Republicans out and halter the African Americans there by force, by bribery, by whatever. At one point in Memphis, the Army's going to have to come in to reestablish peace. The reason it was so violent in Memphis was, in Memphis you had an interesting situation where there were a whole lot of African Americans who'd served in the Army during the Civil War, who lived around there, and they brought their guns home. And they weren't gonna put up with this stuff. And so suddenly you've got out and out fights. And the African Americans didn't always come out on the bottom by any means. But these enforcement acts will do a little bit. This guy, Amos Ackerman, is the Attorney General of the United States. He's going to be very successful. What they do is they grab these KKK guys, they take them out of state for trial, because they're never going to get a conviction in their home state. And they start putting them in jail, not for really long terms, but maybe 5-year term, things like that. And that pretty much wipes, nobody's going to go around bragging he belongs to the KKK anymore. In 1873 in Louisiana, there is a disputed election. It's a crooked election. A real hardline racist guy gets elected sheriff, and the black people in Grant Parish decide to have a meeting to discuss who they go to about this crooked election. They bring guns because, well, self-defense. They're worried about being attacked on the way to the meeting. They have it in the Colfax County, in the county courthouse, because they figure that's the one safe place we can have a meeting. But they're surrounded pretty quickly by white militia, even from other counties. The word goes out. They surround the place. They demand that the African Americans in that building throw their guns out and surrender. There's gunfire that breaks out. Nobody knows exactly who started it. At the end of the day, maybe as many as 150, maybe more. We really don't know. African Americans are killed. A few white people are killed. Of course, Louisiana isn't going to put any white man on trial for killing a black man. Not at that time. So the federal government comes in and charges 3 of the leaders of this militia gang, or whatever you want to call them. The court case gets all the way up to the Supreme Court. The name of the case is Cruikshank versus the United States. I'll show you about the court case in a minute. I wanted to mention that another Civil Rights Act is passed after the Colfax Massacre. It's based pretty much on the 14th Amendment. Charles Sumner, Congressman Benjamin Butler was a general in the Civil War. He's the guy that sat on New Orleans. Congress passes the act in 1875 February. President signs it into law on the 1st of March, 1875. 1876, we're going to have a trial against some of the perpetrators at the Colfax Massacre. It's United States versus Cruikshank. And the government argues that these people that were murdered had their civil rights violated, which was a federal law. I guess killing someone is the ultimate violation of your civil rights. And the court's going to come out with a strange decision. The court's going to say your argument is based on the 14th Amendment, but the 14th Amendment, you're misinterpreting the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was written to protect individual people from being oppressed by local governments. It doesn't protect individual people from the acts of other individual people. And they throw the case out, and these guys all walk. And that's going to set a bad precedent. And there will be later other court cases. And eventually they'll throw out the Civil Rights Act of 1875, saying that it's based on a misinterpretation of the 14th Amendment. And so the cause of civil rights, right at the end of the war, you had a lot of African American participation in local government. You had, you had 2 African American senators. You had, trying to find some numbers, I'm trying to remember how many members of the House of Representatives were African American in the very first days of Reconstruction. But as we move through Reconstruction, let's say we start Reconstruction somewhere near the end of the Civil War, and as you go into the 1870s, it gets weaker and weaker and weaker. And so instead of improving civil rights, they get worse as it moves in the direction of 1900. Especially because of court cases like United States versus Cruikshank. What else is going on when Grant becomes president? We have corruption in the government. Was Grant corrupt? I don't think so. The reason I say that is he died a poor man. He wasn't a gambler or anything like that. So if somebody was getting paid off, it wasn't Grant. The first good scandal was about the railroads. There was a company, pretty new company, founded sometime in the 1860s, called Credit Mobilier, modeled after a company over in France. And Credit Mobilier of America sold raw materials to the Union Pacific Railroad. That was their only customer. And this was hinky, or whatever you want to call it. This was wrong because Credit Mobilier was actually owned and operated by the board of directors of the Union Pacific Railroad. So in other words, they're buying from themselves. Guess what? You can set whatever price you want if you're buying from yourself. Not only that, if you're really good with paperwork, you don't have to move anything. You can sell your stuff that doesn't exist because you're both the buyer and the seller. Obviously conflict of interest, obviously fraudulent. Now, eventually, some congressmen are going to sniff this out around the time that Andrew Johnson is president. And one of the leaders of this ring, Credit Mobilier Group, by the way, they didn't use their real names in connection with that company, a guy named Thomas Durant, is worried about being investigated by Congress, so he buys himself a representative. We're talking about multimillionaires, so they can buy a representative, right? It's a guy named Oakes Ames from Massachusetts. And he tells him, Oakes, oh boy, I'm filling your pockets up with some stuff you like. What I want you to do is keep Congress from investigating us. And so Oakes Ames is going to go around Congress paying people off, either with cash or shares of Credit Mobilier. He's got quite a few shares of it himself. And Congress is not going to investigate. I bet you 50% of the members of Congress own shares of Credit Mobilier. So it's not going to get investigated until a reporter gloms onto it and starts publishing articles about it in 1871, 1872. And when it comes to the notice of the public, there's a giant scandal. Congress is doing all sorts of weird things. They voted themselves a raise. When these scandals all break, they're going to have to get rid of the raise because it looks really bad. Everyone's going to blame Grant for Credit Mobilier, but it existed long before he became president. It's not his problem. And they're going to investigate this, and there's going to be a lot of people, not congressmen, but a lot of other people who do some jail time for Credit Mobilier. Another kind of corruption we had all the way through the Civil War and after it is political corruption, political party machines. One example of that, it's just an example, both parties I'm sure had it, but the one example was Tammany Hall. It was the Democratic Party political machine of New York City. Tammany Hall was so strong that if you wanted a building permit or anything like that, you didn't go to the government. you slipped a little bit of money to Tammany Hall and they get your permit for you. If one of your friends was about to go to jail for something, you go to Tammany Hall, pay the right man a little bit of money, and then they'd go whisper in the judge's ear and your friend wouldn't be convicted. I mean, they were deep into it. The boss of Tammany Hall at that time was a guy named William Tweed. They called him Boss Tweed. He eventually made, I don't know, between $20 and $27 million in corrupt money. And eventually, when people start paying too much attention to his ill-gotten gains, he takes off for Europe to hide out. Funny thing happened to him. I don't know if you've read your notes and readings. One part of it was 2 political cartoons drawn by Thomas Nast. Well, Thomas Nast wrote a lot of cartoons about political issues and humanitarian issues, things of that nature. He wrote a whole bunch of them about Tammany Hall. I couldn't include all of them, but I did include this one. Now, the real significance of this cartoon is Boss Tweed beating up on the voters, making them do what he wants. He was hiding out in Spain, and the Spanish people saw this cartoon, and they misunderstood it because it was all in English. And the misunderstanding was they thought that this was a big old man beating up on 2 little kids. And they thought, this guy's a pedophile. And the Spanish didn't mind corruption too much, but they didn't like pedophiles, so they kicked him out of Spain. We got him, and we put him in jail. And he spent the rest of his life in jail. I don't know if we ever got any of his money back. Then another one was the gold scandal. We called it Black Friday. It's a different kind of Black Friday from what we use now. This Black Friday was when the stock market started to fall apart because of this gold scandal. 2 entrepreneurs, Jay Gould, wealthy financier, James Fisk, a little bit less wealthy. Both of them owned big hunks of some of the major railroads, like the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Erie Railroad. They were friends of Boss Tweed. That's good enough recommendation right there. They decide to corner the gold market. Here's how that works out. The federal government gold reserves were worth about $100 million. The rest of the gold out on the market, see, I can figure some values here. The rest of the gold out on the open gold market was in the much lower millions. So, what Fisk and Gould decided to do, corner the market, get a bunch of investors, they weren't going to use their own money, buy up all the gold that's there, hold it really tightly so none of it's sold, and eventually that's going to drive the price of gold up. When the price of gold raises high enough, then they'll sell all the gold they have and put the money in their pockets and share with their investors. The only problem is that the federal government has more gold than there is on the open market. So they're going to have to figure out a strategy to keep the federal government from selling gold. And what they do is they recruit a couple of guys. One's named Abel Corbin. He was a small-time speculator, financier. Abel Corbin was married to Virginia Grant, to Jenny Grant, President Grant's little sister. And they talked Corbin in for a share of the action into going to Grant and making sure Grant realizes he shouldn't sell gold. That's one thing they get Corbin to do for them. Then they promise him, when we get done with this deal, you're going to make a lot of money. The other thing they ask Corbin to do is they've got a guy they want to put into the Treasury Department in a high position so they can have a watchdog to make sure that the Treasury Department doesn't catch him off guard by selling gold. The guy they want in there is Daniel Butterfield, former Major General in the Union Army, a Medal of Honor holder, a great soldier, but not really smart about finance or anything of that nature. And they offer him a big amount of money to be their watchdog in the Treasury Department. And I don't know what kind of song and dance they gave him, but he was basically their spy. And his whole job is to encourage the Secretary of the Treasury not to sell gold and to tip them off if he decides to sell it anyway. Corbyn's supposed to do the same thing with the president. Corbyn tastes this money he's about to make. He's so excited about it, he writes to his sister-in-law, the president's wife, and tells her, you don't have to worry. The Grants didn't have a lot of money. They didn't have anything but the president's salary. And he tells her, you're not going to have to worry about money for the rest of your life. We're going to make enough for us and all our relatives. Don't worry about it. I've got this deal worked out. The letter's passed to the president. He reads it and says, what the hell are they doing? And he goes to the Secretary of the Treasury, an honest man by the name of Boutwell, and he says, tomorrow morning, without warning anyone, sell $4 million worth of gold, of federal gold. Just dump it on the market. Jay Gould gets a tip off, probably from Butterfield. Jay Gould goes to his friend and co-conspirator Jim Fisk and says, Jim, old boy, I'm so busy working with the railroad and all of that, I don't have time for this. Would you like to buy my shares? And he sells all his shares to Jim Fisk. And then Fisk, and this is only a matter of hours, right? Fisk suddenly realizes, it dawns on him, why gold semi all those things so cheap? And he realizes he needs to sell his too. So he's going to sell them to unwary investors. And of course, the next morning, when the Fed dumps the gold on the market, the value of gold takes a dive. And when you're talking about millions of dollars, it doesn't have to be that much of a dive. And so all the investors lose everything they've got. You know, Gould didn't gamble. He was gambling with other people's money. It causes a crash on the market. It causes a sort of a depression for a few years. We're going to barely recover from that depression. We're going to go into another one in 1873. But at least Grant, when he figured out what they were doing, he stopped them. And he does that over and over again. He doesn't get credit for it. There's other scandals that you'll find out about, and he'll deal with it in his own way. Another example, the whiskey ring. The whiskey ring's really big money. Here's the deal. The head of the, what the hell is it called? It's the Office of Revenue. He's a Treasury agent in St. Louis. His name is John A. McDonald. He's the supervisor for Internal Revenue in St. Louis. Every time that the whiskey people ship out whiskey, they have to pay tax on it, excise tax on it. He goes to them, I don't know exactly how he presented the offer, but he suggests to them, you know, if that 100,000 gallons of whiskey that you sell every year was only 50,000, you'd pay a lot less tax. So, what if I just report that you only sold 50,000 when you sold 100,000? You're going to make a lot of money on that. Would you be willing to split a little bit of that with me? And they are. And he's making good money. And then some other Treasury officers from other cities notice he's living a little bit high off the hog. If you're a crook, right? Here's a lesson to remember if you plan to become a crook. Don't flash your money around. The Secretary of the Treasury doesn't now, because this guy's an inspector, right? The Secretary of the Treasury now doesn't trust his own inspectors. He goes out and hires private detectives. And they find out that this deal is going on in St. Louis, and I think Baltimore, and some other big cities in the East. Not only that, he finds out that they're paying off the Secretary's, or the President's Chief of Staff, or Private Secretary is what they called him back then, Orville Babcock, another Army general. They're paying him off to keep them appraised of what the President's up to. Whole bunch of people, 175 or something people are indicted. Babcock's indicted. The President really leans on the court, and the court doesn't convict Babcock of anything. And the President saved him from going to jail because he'd done good work for him, but he fired him. Got rid of him, got him out of the White House. By the way, at some stage of the game, I think it was the whiskey ring, some of the whiskey sellers tried to give the President a big set of furniture and some pretty stuff like that. And as soon as he hears where it came from, it's all boxed up and sent back where it came from. Another form of corruption, the Department of War, the Secretary of War, was running the Indian reservations. Sometime along this period of time, the Department of the Interior is going to take responsibility, but at this particular time, that's not the way it is. Secretary of War controls who gets to be an Indian agent. What does an Indian agent do? They're the guys that get federal money, and they have the job of buying the food and all that that's guaranteed to the Indians for staying on the reservation. And there's all sorts of corruption going on in that. And it becomes obvious, I think, to Secretary Belknap's wife. I think people approached him through her. It becomes obvious that you can make a lot of money just selling appointments to be Indian agents. You know, they run the trading post, all of that. So she's going to start getting money, which I assume he gets, for giving people the job of Indian agent. And Congress is going to find out about this. There's complaints. And they're going to start investigating Belknap, and they're going to be almost ready to impeach him. He finds out they're going to impeach him later on in the day, and he rushes to the President and he says, I'm in trouble. I need to quit. I need to get out of office. And he will do so forthwith, having told the President he was leaving. They impeached him. They put him on trial, actually, in the Senate. And they were voting on whether or not to convict him, and it seems as though there were enough votes to convict him when they got word that he had resigned from the position of Secretary of War, and they decided to stop voting. And they dropped it. So he never got convicted, but he did get kicked out of office. Okay. Enough corruption. I got to point out to you over and over again. He picked a good attorney general who went after some of this corruption. He picked Secretary Boutwell to clean up the Treasury and the whiskey scandal. But he did defend the people that worked for him. And some of them were just as dirty as could be. But he died a poor man. He died a poor man. So I really find it difficult to say that he was involved in corruption. So we've moved through some of the civil rights stuff. We've moved through some of the corruption that existed. Foreign policy, let's talk a little bit about that. Here's the two guys in the U.S. government that ran the foreign policy. The guy in the upper left, the Secretary of State Hamilton Fish, the guy in the lower right, the Senator Charles Sumner, yes, the same guy that got beat up in the House of the Senate before the war. He's the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And usually they get along really well, and they cooperate. And they handle a lot of issues we have with the British. We have lawsuits going on with the British. We have problems with the Spanish. And they together handle this very well. But they're going to disagree on some things, and one of them is this: Santo Domingo. Santo Domingo was the old name for the Dominican Republic. The President of the United States was very interested in Santo Domingo. He was also interested in Cuba, but he didn't think that was a good idea to mess around with Cuba. Santo Domingo, though, had a central location in the middle of the Caribbean, and the President was very worried about European influence in the Caribbean. Remember, the Monroe Doctrine said, America for the Americans. He wanted, first of all, a place to park American warships in the Caribbean. Second of all, he wanted to keep foreign interference in the Caribbean to a minimum. The British had islands there, the Dutch had islands there, the Spanish had islands there. Thirdly, and this is kind of a little bit more subtle, he thought if the American government annexed the Dominican Republic, made it part of the United States, it would give African Americans from the South an alternative to hanging around in the South where they were being discriminated against and beat up and what have you. And he thought the effect of that would force Southern planters to start being nice to freedmen, because if they weren't nice to them, they'd leave and go to the Dominican Republic. He thought that was a subtle way of getting the Southerners in line. So he has the Secretary of State draw up a possible treaty with the current government of Santo Domingo so that we can annex that country into our country. Now, it doesn't include that whole island, because the other part of the island is Haiti, and they were independent. Remember, they drove the French out. But he offered the Dominican Republic the opportunity, if you sign this treaty and become part of the U.S., eventually you might even get to be a state. And that's a pretty big offer. The only problem was that when it came to Congress, the chairman of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations didn't like the idea. In fact, he really didn't like the idea. And so when it goes there for consideration, they're going to give it a giant thumbs down. They won't always disagree with what he's doing, though. Another problem he has are the Fenians. The Fenians are Irish, anti-British in the United States. What they're doing is they attack across the border, whack at the British, and then come running back across the border. And this was making the British very angry. But rather than going to war with it, they remonstrated verbally and not physically. And we realized we needed to stop that from happening, so we shut the Fenians down on our side of the border. That happened. The raids were going on in between 1866 and 1871. We also settled the Alabama claims. These were claims we had against the English for helping Confederate warships have a place to park, a place to get supplies and things like that, so that they could attack American merchantmen. And rather than go to war, we're going to submit our case to an international tribunal. We're going to sue the British, and we're actually going to win this one. Hamilton Fish was a pretty smooth cookie. We won $15.5 million, which is a hell of a lot of money back then. Of course, I'd still like to have $15.5 million, but it meant a lot more then than it means now. Then there's the Virginius affair. There's a war called the 10 Years' War in Cuba. It's an uprising against the Spanish army. The rebels rent an American ship to transport supplies to them from the United States. The crew of the ship is about 50-50, English and American. They get paid pretty well. The Spanish Navy is going to catch them. The Spanish Navy, not very diplomatic, they're going to start hanging the crew members, one after the other. They have a real quick court-martial and run that guy up on the yardarm. We find out about this. Families are screaming bloody murder, the families of the crew members. Our Secretary of State gets in touch with the Spanish Secretary of State and threatens to go to war with Spain or whatever, and Spain's not ready to do that. So they stop executing the crew members of the Virginius, that's the name of the ship, and they return the Virginius to its owners, and they send money to the families of the Americans who were executed. And they reach the same kind of an agreement with the British. So Fish is a pretty good negotiator. Another thing he's going to negotiate is something called the Burlingame Treaty. This is a treaty with the Royal Court of China about immigration. We had a lot of Chinese immigrants. Why'd they come over here? Well, they came over to get away from the first Opium War. They came over here to join in on the California Gold Strike. They came here to get away from the Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion was a almost religious kind of rebellion that happened in China. 20 million people died in that rebellion. So these people don't want to be there. And they come over to work in America, and there's a lot of people that don't want them to come here. There's a lot of people that feel like they're taking jobs away. But we settle a treaty with China. If they give us access to China, so our businessmen and people like that can go to China, then they can send their workers over here. That's the Burlingame Treaty. We will eventually break that treaty. Who's this guy? He's the governor of New York. He's the guy, when he was the Attorney General of New York, who prosecuted Boss Tweed and put him in jail. Anybody ever seen the movie The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance? Nobody? Well, that's a John Wayne movie, Jimmy Stewart and John Wayne. The theory of the thing is that this guy has a reputation of killing a really bad man, and so he gets elected governor eventually. Well, Samuel Tilden was a real guy that he put Boss Tweed in jail. And so he's pretty famous up in New York. He's well known. That makes it, maybe he's got a chance, even though he's a Democrat, maybe he's got a chance of getting elected. And in fact, he did very well in the election. Now, he's not going to run against Grant because Grant got reelected in 1872, and enough people from his own party think we need to change because America's getting upset about all the corruption. It wasn't Grant's fault. It's just that Grant didn't do enough about it, apparently. So it's going to be Rutherford B. Hayes, a former Major General in the Union Army from Ohio, against Samuel J. Tilden of New York. Don't have time to talk about it very long, but I'll leave this hanging with you. Samuel J. Tilden won the largest number of popular votes by, let me think, see if I can find it. He won by 300,000 votes over Rutherford Hayes. And he won by 184 to 165 electoral votes. But he's not going to be the next president of the United States. We'll pick up talking about that next time. So if any of you think that some of the funny things that happen in our elections now are strange, far from the first time. The important thing is, our country never fell apart because of it. Thank you very much. See you guys on Wednesday when we start getting ready for the final. Thank you. Say again?
Did you drive that white Jeep?
Yeah.
It's nice, I like it.
I like it too, but it drinks a lot of
True.
diesel. But
Um,
it'll pull like hell. I mean, it's the same engine that the dualies have.
oh yeah?
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
I don't like the extra two wheels. I drove a dually for a long time, and
Oh yeah?
yeah, every time you need new tires, guess what? You gotta buy 6.
Yep, that's true. What day is our final exam gonna be? Cause I was looking at the schedule.
Okay, I'm setting it up for this class
Mhm.